What's going on guys, Jin here, and this is an Lash build. It easily deals with bosses, tier 100 dungeons, vaults, and the overworld alike. If you like the guides I do, please consider subscribing, liking, and hitting the notification bell as it helps out a lot. Thanks guys, now onto the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to be taking 5 into Lash, and we're going to be going for Glinting Lash, although Flickering Lash is fine as well, I just prefer the Glinting. We're also going to take 1 into Firebolt, and then come down here into our core skills, and we're going to take 5 into Fireball. Next in our defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, and go up to Shimmering Flame Shield. 5 into Teleport, and going into Shimmering Teleport. 3 into Glass Cannon. 1 into Elemental Attunement. 1 into Ice Armor, and we're going for Mystical Ice Armor. Now in our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, and go for the Summoned Ice Blades. As an alternative, you could also take Lightning Spear, and go for Invoke Lightning Spear, and you would do this if you're more focused on speed clearing and nightmare dungeons, etc. Moving on from there, you would take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, and 3 into Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're just taking 3 into Icy Veil, and we're going to take 1 into Inner Flames to get to the 3 in Devouring Blaze. For our ultimate skills, we're just taking 1 into Unstable Currents, and 1 into Prime Unstable Currents. We are not going to take the Supreme Unstable Currents. Then we take 1 into Coursing Currents, so we can get the 3 into Electrocution and into Conduction. And then we're just going to put 1 into Convulsions. Lastly, for our key passive, we're going to put in Veer's Mastery here. And that pretty much wraps up the skill tree. Now the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, in the starting board here, we're going to put in Tactician. That's going to give us 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. We also get 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range, so the non-physical damage and resistance to all elements. For our second board, we're going to take the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist Glyph here, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all your damage by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. And we also get a lot of extra non-physical damage and resistance to all elements thanks to the Paragon node boost. For our third board, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board. And we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph here for all of that critical strike damage, as well as getting the crit strikes increase or damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 12%. For the fourth board, it's going to be the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Flame Feeder Glyph here, so we're going to get that 97% damage to burning enemies if your glyph is maxed out, and also you deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. The fifth board, we're going to be taking Elemental Summoner, and we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph here for a bunch of extra vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. For the sixth board, we're going to be taking the Searing Heat board, and we're going to be putting in the Control Glyph here, so we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And for our last board, it's going to be the Frigid Fate board. And for the glyph, we're putting in Territorial, and that's going to give us an extra bunch of damage to close enemies, but also 15% damage reduction against close enemies. So that wraps up the Paragon board. Everything's going to be in the build planner in the description below, so check that out if you want to go at your own pace through the gear, Paragon board, skills, etc. So now for the enchantments, we're going to be taking Fireball as our first enchantment. So when we kill an enemy, they're going to explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. That's just a bunch more damage there. Optionally, you could put in the teleport here for the enchantment effect of evade being replaced with a short range teleport. And for our second enchantment, we're going to be taking the Firebolt enchantment. So this is going to allow our direct damage from our skills to apply burning damage. Next, for the Seneschal construct, we're going to be taking Tempest as our first governing stone, and our supports are going to be Breaking, Efficiency, and Arcing supports. For our second governing stone, we're going to be using Flash of Adrenaline, and we're going to be putting in Tactical support, Duration support, and Initiative support. If you have access to Genesis, you would replace Initiative support with Genesis, and if you have Evernight, you would replace Efficiency with Evernight. So for the gear, I'll list the best affixes that I think you should have from best to worst on the left side of the screen, and let's get into it. Starting with the Helm, you're going to want to look for something with total armor percent, cooldown reduction, basic skill attack speed, and intelligence. If you can't get that, then look for max life or all stats. As for the aspect, you're going to be using the aspect of Might here. For the basic skills, grant 20% damage reduction for 2 to 6 seconds. Now, if you have a Godslayer crown, you would use that for bossing, and if you have a Shaco, then you would use that. Next up, we have the chest piece. We're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, damage reduction against burning, and damage reduction against close or distant. If you can't get those, then look for damage percent or intelligence. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Disobedience here for that massive armor boost. Gain 1.1% at max roll, increase armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. Next up we have the gloves, and we're going to be using the Pain Gorge's gauntlets here. So that's going to give us some all stats, good amount of attack speed, good amount of crit chance, and a big increase to our basic skill damage. But we're mainly using it for this unique aspect here. So damaging enemies with a non-basic skill marks them for 3 seconds, and when a basic skill first hits a marked enemy, the basic skill's damage is echoed to all of the marked enemies, and dealing an extra 100 to 200% multiplicative increased damage. It's pretty crucial to the build, but if you don't happen to have one of these, you would want to look for something with critical hit chance, attack speed, ranks into Fireball, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then you would be looking for something like critical hit chance against injured, or all stats. And for the aspect, you would want to use something like Conceited. So that's going to give you 15 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. Next up we have the pants. We're going to go for Tybalt's Will here. So that's going to give you some damage, and damage reduction from close enemies. So the max resource doesn't really do anything for our build, but we're mainly using it for the damage and for this unique aspect here. So we get 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. So if you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, damage reduction against distant, damage reduction against burning, and flat damage reduction. If you can't get those, then damage reduction against close, or damage reduction against injured. Pretty straightforward there, and for the aspect you would want to use something like Everliving. So that's going to let you take 20 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. For the boots, we're going to be using Flicker Step here, so that's going to give us a bunch of all stats, movement speed, ultimate skill damage, and some damage reduction from close enemies. But more importantly, each enemy we evade through reduces our active ultimate cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds, up to 10 seconds per evade. That's going to allow us to keep our ultimate up almost permanently if we're evading properly, depending on how many enemies there are on the screen. If you don't have access to Flicker Step, then you would look for Esu's Heirloom. That's just going to give you some more critical strike chance and critical strike damage, as well as a lot of movement speed. If you don't have access to either, then you would look for boots with movement speed %, ranks into teleport, intelligence, and all stats. If you can't get those, then look for flame shield or damage reduction when injured. And for the aspect, you would want to use Ghostwalkers, so while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. Now for the main hand, you're going to be looking for a dagger here, and you're going to be looking for intelligence, basic skill damage, critical strike damage, and all stats. If you can't get those, then look for damage to vulnerable, damage to close, or lightning critical strike damage. As for the aspect, we're going to be looking for the Edgemaster's aspect here, so skills deal up to 20%, in my case increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast. And of course for the main hand and offhand, look for the highest item power possible for the most base damage. For the offhand, we're going to be looking for something with critical strike chance, basic skill damage, basic skill attack speed, and cooldown reduction. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction against burning, intelligence, or all stats. And for the aspect, we're going to be using the rapid aspect here, so our basic skills gain 15 to 30% attack speed. Pretty straightforward there. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going to be looking for something with total armor, ranks into Devouring Blaze, movement speed %, and cooldown reduction. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction against close, or damage reduction against distant. And for the aspect, we're going to be using Storm Surge here, so we're going to do an extra 32 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next for the rings, we're going to be looking for rings with critical strike chance, critical hit damage, lightning damage, and damage to close enemies. If you can't get those, then look for things like lightning critical strike damage, damage to vulnerable, or damage to burning enemies. Both rings we're going to be looking for the same affixes, and for the aspects, we're going to be looking for the aspect of adaptability, so that will allow our basic skills to deal 40 to 80% increased damage depending on your role when above 50% resource, which is all the time. And for our secondary aspect, we're going to be looking for Moonrise, so damaging an enemy with a basic skill grants us 4% attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, and upon reaching maximum stacks, we enter a Vampiric Blood Rage, gaining 40 to 80% basic skill damage and 15% movement speed for 10 seconds. And that pretty much wraps up all the gear you're going to be needing for this build. For the gems, you're going to be using the yellow or green gems in the weapons, so that's either going to give you basic skill damage or critical strike damage against vulnerable enemies. For the jewelry, you're going to be using the skulls for armor, and for the armor you're going to be using the red gems for maximum life. So that about wraps up the build. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, or if you happen to make it this far through sheer luck, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It helps out a lot, and I'd really like this channel to grow. Cheers guys, have a great day, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye!